Hey everybody, and welcome to the 5 Bytes podcast. I'm your host, Rory Monahan. Coming up on this week's episode, Secure Boot may be compromised on hundreds of models of different devices. Also, Azure suffers a pretty widespread outage that affected many services. And more fallout for the CrowdStrike from the content update gone wrong. For this and more, keep listening to this episode of the podcast, which of course, as always, is brought to you by my sponsors. And that includes ControlUp, end-to-end digital experience management for the work from anywhere era. ControlUp, happy users, happy IT. And also brought to you by Network's Policy Pack, where you use Group Policy Pack Cloud or MDM to remove local admin rights, manage lockdown applications, Java browsers, and mitigate ransomware, plus more. And also brought to you by Numescent, the inventors of the first and only cloud-native container management platform for Windows desktops. And of course, also brought to you by Master Packager, who make an application packaging software that helps you build packages that end users love, enterprises want, and the Windows OS needs. If you enjoyed the show each week, you have these awesome sponsors to thank. And now for some news. A report this week found that 1 in 4 Fortune 500 companies was impacted by the CrowdStrike outage, which cost them an estimated $5.4 billion. On July 25th, CEO George Kurtz said that more than 97% of Windows sensors were back online, but that CrowdStrike's work was not yet complete. A detailed blog post published by CrowdStrike suggested a bug in test software for not properly validating the content update that was pushed out to millions of machines on the Friday in question. CrowdStrike is promising to more thoroughly test its content updates, improve its error handling, and implement a staggered deployment to avoid a repeat of the disaster. And they also had made some claims about potentially making other changes to the product and allowing customers to change the update cadence across their organization. So it'll be interesting to see if that actually comes to fruition. Shares of CrowdStrike fell more than 8% this Tuesday after a report that Delta Airlines are going to seek compensation from the firm over their recent IT outage that crippled the airline industry, but no one more so than Delta, who were very heavily impacted by the outage. And for an idea of just how badly it affected airlines, 2,200 flights were canceled on July 19th, and Delta canceled over 6,000 flights so far since the outage occurred. For some reason, Delta seems to have taken a very long time to try and recover from the outage. I'm not sure why they're particularly badly hit, but they seem to be particularly badly hit. And just for an idea of the real-world impact of this outage and the fact that it affected flights, it was reported that an 83-year-old man went missing for several days after his flight from Florida to California was canceled due to the CrowdStrike outage. Patrick Bailey was supposed to fly home to Sacramento from Orlando on July 21st after visiting his sister. However, when his flight was canceled, it appears he had to make alternative plans. Whilst missing, his family said that he had a bad back, so he was unlikely to be able to get like a rental car and make the drive cross-country. Eventually, a whole week later on July 28th, Patrick Bailey resurfaced, and it was found that he had hopped on a cross-country Greyhound bus and he forgot his phone in his hotel room. Thus, they couldn't contact him for that entirety of the trip, and a cross-country bus trip takes a long time. I mean, thankfully, this is a missing person report that has a happy ending, but this is just one individual story of a real-life impact from this outage. Between 11:45 UTC and 7:43 UTC on the 30th of July 2024, which was this past Tuesday, a subset of Azure customers experienced issues connecting to a subset of Microsoft services globally. The impacted services included Azure App Services, Application Insights, Azure IoT Central, Azure Log Search Alerts, Azure Policy, as well as the Azure portal itself and a subset of Microsoft 365 and Microsoft Purview services, according to the actual Azure status. However, there are also reports of many online and from the likes of the BBC reporting issues in Outlook, Intune, Entra ID, and even Minecraft. It's reported once the nature of the usage spike, it appears the outage was caused by a quote-unquote usage spike, which sounds like a denial of service. But once the usage spike was understood, they implemented a networking configuration change to support denial of service protection efforts and performed failovers to alternate networking paths to provide relief. Their initial network configuration changes successfully mitigated the majority of the impact by 2:10 UTC, but some customers reported less than 100% availability, which then they began mitigating around 6 p.m. UTC. Failure rates did not return to the pre-incident levels until 7:43 p.m. UTC. After monitoring traffic and services to ensure that the issue was fully mitigated, Microsoft declared the incident fully mitigated at 8:48 p.m. UTC. So for those keeping score at home, that is a 9-hour service degradation or outage. I mean, it seemed to be an outage for a lot of people, not just degradation. They said some downstream services took longer to recover depending on how they were configured. So certainly not a good 2 or 3 weeks for cloud services. Before the outage even occurred this week, Microsoft stock had fallen about 7% off the back of news of slowing growth of its Azure services, which I should emphasize is not a lack of growth, just slower growth for the quarter compared to previous quarters. Microsoft also indicated further investments in infrastructure to support AI services, which has been pretty heavily reported on in the last few weeks as being more of a long-term profit initiative. It was recently reported that OpenAI themselves require further investment or they risk bankruptcy because, again, it's not generating a profit immediately. Due to the high resource demands, generative AI is a wild swing for companies. It's hard to make back the investment in the short term, which can make the investment a little risky, which it's no surprise that those in the stock market and investors, they typically don't like risk, so that can affect the stock price. Secure Boot, which is a requirement for Windows 11, has reportedly been compromised on 200 models of different devices from the likes of Acer, Dell, Gigabyte, Intel, and Supermicro after a cryptographic key that underpins the feature was exposed on a GitHub repository in December 2022. The disclosure of the key went largely unnoticed until January 2023, when Binnerly researchers discovered it while investigating a supply chain incident, according to a report by Ars Technica. Now that the leak has come to light, security experts say it effectively torpedoes the security assurances offered by Secure Boot. Researchers have further stated the exposure of the key is just part of a supply chain breakdown nicknamed PK Fail that raises serious doubts about the integrity of Secure Boot on more than 300 additional device models from virtually all major device manufacturers. Ars Technica has shared a list of affected devices along with the way to check to see if your device may be affected by the compromise. They suggest there is no good workaround at this time, and they just have hopes of manufacturers patching this in future. Google has announced significant changes to Chrome security on Windows to help protect against info stealers utilizing cookies on Windows machines to leverage for breaches. In Chrome version 127, Google are introducing a new protection on Windows that improves on the DPAPI by providing application-bound encryption primitives, DPAPI being a built-in security feature within Windows for data protection such as adding cookies. Rather than allowing any application running as the logged-in user to access the data, Chrome will now encrypt data tied to the app identity, similar to how Keychain operates on macOS. Google say they'll be migrating each type of secret currently used to the new system, starting with cookies in Chrome version 127. In future releases, they intend to expand this protection to passwords, payment data, and other persistent authentication tokens, further protecting users from info-stealer malware. They said app-bound encryption increases the cost of data theft for attackers and also makes their actions far noisier on systems. It helps defenders draw a clear line in the sand for what is acceptable behavior for their other apps on the system, and as the malware landscape continually evolves, they are keen to continue engaging with others in the security community on improving detections and strengthening operating system protections, such as stronger app isolation primitives for any bypasses. So, a positive story on the security front for Google Chrome. Reuters has reported that Tenable is exploring a potential sale. The company is reportedly worth about $5 billion and may already have interested suitors, but at this time, they say it's in early stages and just deciding whether or not they wish to entertain an acquisition. So unlike previous reports of, hey, there's an acquisition imminent, this sounds like they're just putting feelers out about being acquired. Andreas Nick warned that since the last hotfix for FSLogix, there appears to be a problem with AppV if OneDrive is also being used. The integration folder from AppV can no longer be accessed, so if you use both, you should plan a downgrade until this issue has been fixed. And hopefully it is going to be fixed. Speaking of AppV, this week I happened to notice a note when attempting to install the AppV sequencer with the latest Windows 10 SDK from May 2024. And the note says, AppV will reach end of life April 2026. After that time, the AppV sequencer will no longer be included in the ADK. And then it says, see the AppV deprecation page for more information, which goes back to the same old page that's been in place for some time, where it links back to the Microsoft Desktop Optimization Pack page rather than a specific AppV page. You can link out to a more specific AppV page, but it's that kind of cyclical of, well, AppV is end of life without really going into significant detail. You know, I've covered the fact that in Server 2025, if you enable AppV, it pops up a similar message, but more so around AppV client being deprecated. I think I'd speculated on this podcast at that time when the Server 2025 preview came out that perhaps the AppV client will be deprecated and kept in the OS so you could continue to use it, but maybe don't expect the greatest level of support on it. And then I figured if they were going to keep that in the OS, that the sequencer would likely also continue and would just be in the ADKs until it's been removed from the OS. But it looks like, at least from this note, that they have no intention of continuing to have the sequencer updated and released as part of the ADKs. And also, just a side note, at least on the Windows 10 ADK, for the May 2024 release or the previous release, which was September 2023, the AppV sequencer actually doesn't work. It launches with an error, and I posted a blog on rorymon.com about those errors and the fact that you have to go 2 versions back in order to find a working version of the sequencer on the Windows 10 ADKs. I'm guessing they're probably not going to fix that, since Windows 10 is end of support in 2025, and then obviously the AppV sequencer appears to be end of life in 2026. So once again, I mean, if you're using AppV, you should be making motions to move away. The Windows device Attestation feature that attests that a certain device is securely enrolled is now in public preview within Microsoft Intune. This is a feature that I covered on the podcast a few weeks or months ago even, but yeah, now it's available in public preview, so try it out. In the latest Canary build for Windows 11, Microsoft has added the ability to change mouse scrolling direction in settings. A small addition, but a significant addition nonetheless. The latest Intune release includes a feature to use Copilot to help create KQL queries for device queries, an enhancement for unmanaged macOS apps, and an update to the Windows 365 security baseline. I did try the security baseline, but I ended up not applying it because I found it too restrictive, but it'd be interesting to see if perhaps they've made it less restrictive with the new baseline. A security issue in the latest version of WhatsApp for Windows allows sending Python and PHP attachments that are executed without any warning when the recipient opens them, according to a report by bleepycomputer.com. For the attack to be successful, Python needs to be installed, which is a prerequisite that may limit the targets to software developers, researchers, power users, and maybe students. Bleepycomputer.com reports that WhatsApp rejected the findings of the report. For WhatsApp part, they stated, quote, "We read what the researcher has proposed and appreciate their submission. Malware can take many different forms, including through downloadable files meant to trick a user. It's why we warn users to never click on or open a file from somebody they don't know, regardless of how they received it, whether over WhatsApp or any other app, end quote. So these types of scripts are not currently on the block list, making this a pretty viable attack path for cyber gangs. And it appears that WhatsApp, for their part, are just deflecting away responsibility and putting it onto the users of their product, which seems pretty lousy. The CEO of Logitech, Henrik Faber, discussed a potential future offering from their company. A forever mouse that would cost around $200 and would be a little heavier than a typical mouse, and had been likened to a nice watch in terms of its quality. It was said the mouse would continue to receive software updates to keep it fresh into the future, thus it being a forever mouse. But of course, the rub here, a suggestion that software updates would require a subscription. The subscription angle of this has been met with a frosty reception online. It's important to note, however, that this is not an official release just yet, and perhaps the subscription offering won't come to fruition, but even the suggestion of it has not been well received. I mean, the one good thing possibly, if it does really last a long time, it cuts down on waste, but it's not going to be a cost-saving thing for customers if they continue to pay a subscription. I could see how it's great for Logitech, and I could see how it maybe makes sense from a sustainability perspective, but it's going to come at a cost to consumers. Microsoft has reportedly added a new full-screen pop-up that's effectively an advert, urging Windows 11 users to back up their PC with OneDrive. Microsoft has stated that this is a recommendation rather than an ad. The recommendation appeared for some after installing recent Windows updates and rebooting. So this is not the first time they've sprung these kinds of pop-ups or added some sort of advertising to the OS. I'm sure it won't be the last time, but I wish it was. TechRadar.com called it an annoying pop-up, and certainly from what I could see on some of the subreddits, people are annoyed by this. To continue a story I recently covered on the podcast, the reported instability issues with Intel's 13th and 14th generation CPUs is continuing to rankle customers, as Intel have no plans to recall their processors. WindowsCentral.com reported that a preventative fix could be rolled out in the coming weeks, but rather damaging for Intel is the fact reports of issues have been ongoing for 2 years. So this is something they've known about for a considerable amount of time. This is also a week when there were reports Intel could lay off over 1,000 employees, and it certainly seems like rocky times at Intel. OpenAI has teased a prototype for their own search engine called SearchGPT, which can utilize ChatGPT to combine the strength of their AI models with information from the web to give you fast and timely answers with clear and relevant sources, which honestly, I thought that's kind of what GPT-4 and up is already doing, because it does tap into current information, it seems, or at least within data from 2023 and back. Although it seems to pick current information in 4.0 from what I could see. Search is being made available to a small group of users and publishers in order for them to get feedback. And while the prototype is temporary, they plan to integrate the best of these features directly into ChatGPT in the future. So if you're interested in trying out the prototype, you can sign up to the waiting list. So it'd be interesting to see, like they say, it's just a temporary prototype and it's probably going to get rolled into ChatGPT itself. So I guess we'll keep an eye out for this. Interestingly, OpenAI's announcement comes shortly after Microsoft teased Bing Generative Search. Bing Generative Search, according to techzine.eu, combines the Bing search engine with large and small language models. Based on the language models, the function can understand the search query, but the search result is a summary of information available on the web. So it sounds a little bit similar to Google's AI Overview feature, which they infamously had to walk back pretty significantly due to misinformation. Bing's AI search engine is currently only becoming available in a limited preview. So unlike Google, it looks like they're not going to shotgun spray this very widely. They're going to take a measured approach to its rollout. And now this episode, scripts, tricks, and tips. Alan Kinnan published a blog post recently on managing ACLs in Azure at scale without IAC or scripts. I'm going to keep it there for the scripts, tricks, and tips this week. I know I'm shorting you guys by just having one, but last week's episode was quite long, and this one, just from the stories alone, seemed to be quite long. So I want to try and make an effort to keep it a little bit short on the scripts, tricks, and tips to make up. But as always, thank you so much for listening, and I'll catch you next week.